Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMc Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMc Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and happy November. Yesterday was Halloween, so if you celebrate, I hope you enjoyed. We had a lot of adorable children who came to our house. There were some book-themed children, which made me very happy. There was a Harry Potter. There was a Pete the Cat. Lots of superheroes, of course. One baby shark that tried to eat her father. It was cute. She was in a stroller and Dad had blood all over his shirt. That sounds bad if you didn't know it was Halloween. But the crazy thing about Halloween is you go to bed on October 31st on Halloween and you wake up on November 1st and it's Christmas. Everywhere Christmas. I stopped at the grocery store this morning on my way to work to get something to drink. And they were just Christmas everywhere. Not that it hasn't been already, but poor Thanksgiving always gets the shaft. Anyway. This is the Book Review Podcast, not the I'm Grumpy About Holidays podcast. And we have, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, another interview this week. This week I am speaking with Edward Willett, who writes a lot of fantasy and science fiction. And this is the second in a series that he is writing called the Worldshapers series. The first one is called Worldshaper, and this one is called Master of the World. Let me give you the description of this. I guess Edward's going to describe it to you, but there is a series of worlds. I can't do it. It's going to sound weird if I describe it to you. Have you ever tried describing the plot of certain science fiction or fantasy shows or books to someone and they come out and you're like, well, that just sounds dumb, but it's really good. This isn't dumb. But if I tried to describe it, you might think it sounded weird. I'm just going to read the description and I'm going to let Edward talk about it because obviously he knows what he's talking about and I apparently need a nap. I don't know. Shawna Keys has fled the world she only recently discovered she shaped, narrowly escaping death at the hands of the adversary who seized control of it and losing her only guide, Carl Yatzer, in the process. Now she finds herself alone in some other shaper's world, where in her first 2 hours she's rescued from a disintegrating island by an improbable flying machine she recognizes from Jules Verne's Rober the Conqueror, then seized from it by raiders flying tiny personal helicopters, and finally taken to a submarine that bears a strong resemblance to Captain Nemo's Nautilus. Oh, and she's accused of being both a spy and a witch. Shawna hopes Carl Yatzer will eventually follow her into this new steampunk realm, but exactly where and when he'll show up, she hasn't a clue. In the meantime, she has to navigate a world where two factions fanatically devoted to their respective leaders are locked in perpetual combat, figure out who the shaper of the world is, find him or her, and obtain the secret knowledge of this world's shaping. Then she has to somehow reconnect with Carl Yatzer and escape to the next shaped world in the labyrinth through a portal she has no idea how to open. So easy peasy, right? Yeah, no problem. She just has a series of impossible tasks to accomplish. This book is, there's just so many different things I could talk about. I don't want to give too much away. But from this description, you get that this is a Jules Verne-shaped world. So you get these worlds that have been created based on what we would think of probably as our world, the first world, although who knows, we may be living in a shaped world. So Shawna was the shaper of her world. She's now in another shaper's world. This one is very steampunk-esque, based loosely on a lot of Jules Verne's writings. So if you're a fan of Jules Verne, you'll recognize a lot of different elements of his books in this book. Even if you're not a fan of Jules Verne, then it's okay because, you don't have to have read the books to get many of the references and to know that this is a very literary themed world, except where the shaper wants to shape it to his or her own ideas. So, for instance, those little personal helicopters, not in Jules Verne's books, but they worked for the shaper's purposes. So that's where the science fiction and the fantasy kind of combine, because there is it's the science fiction of Jules Verne's world, but then there's fantasy elements as well with the portal, and fantasy is just magic is just science we haven't figured out yet, right? So portals could be a thing. Anyway, both of these books are a lot of fun. I was able to read both of them. No, let me be clear. I was able to listen to the audiobooks of both of them. There are audiobooks for these, and I was very excited to get both of them and be able to listen to both of them before I spoke with Edward. Sometimes I read the second or third book in a series and haven't had a chance to go back and read the first or second or, the previous books. So I was really excited to be able to do these both at once. The audiobooks are great. They are narrated by two different people, but for once that didn't bug me so much. They are very similar in style and voice. I listened to them back to back and didn't have a problem of, this is not the right narrator, as I sometimes complain about. So really enjoyed listening to them, really enjoyed the story and the characters. Shawna is really interesting, and she has a quirky sense of humor, and she makes a lot of funny pop culture references that nobody gets, of course, because she's not in her own world. So I liked that about her. I am going to go ahead now and let Edward tell you more about this. I almost called him Carl because I was looking at the back of the book. It is not Carl. It is Edward. He wrote the book. He wrote Carl. So let's go ahead and get to the interview with Edward Willett. Again, it's the Worldshapers series, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the first one, Worldshaper, and more about the second, Master of the World. Here's that interview.
Hi, Edward. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, and I am excited to talk to you about your new book. It's called Master of the World. It's the second in a series. Before we get there, though, and talk about the books, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Well, I am, my bio always starts with, I'm the award-winning author of more than 60 books of fantasy, science fiction, and nonfiction for readers of all ages. How's that for a little potted bio? I live in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. Been a full-time writer, freelance writer for 26 years as of this fall. Started my career as a newspaper reporter, so my degree was in journalism, and did that, and then was a communications officer at a science center for a few years, and then went full-time freelance a quarter of a century ago now, which is hard to believe. So I write both nonfiction and fiction. On the fiction side, science fiction and fantasy. I've done both young adult and adult books for a number of publishers, but my main publisher is Daw Books in New York, one of the major science fiction fantasy publishers.
Mm-hmm. So this is the book that we're talking about mainly today is, as I said, called Master of the World. It is the second in a series called Worldshapers. So we should probably start at the beginning. If you can talk about the first book is called Worldshaper in the Worldshapers series. So can you give a brief overview of that book?
Sure. Worldshaper appears to be happening as it starts in our world. The main character is Shawna. She's a young woman, late 20s, who is just opening a pottery studio in this mid-sized Montana city. And everything's going really well in her life. She's got the pottery studio. She's got a great boyfriend. She's got a best friend. And the best friend comes along, and they go down to have some coffee. And then the only thing that's been a little weird is that this mysterious stranger has been showing up outside her bedroom window in the middle of the night. She's on the second floor, and she sees him standing in the street. Then she sees him outside this coffee shop briefly, and then shortly after that, there's an attack and by black-clad terrorists who burst into the coffee shop and start shooting it up and killing people, and her best friend is killed. And the leader of the terrorists comes over and touches her on the forehead, and then he steps back and says, "Goodbye, Shawna," and points the gun at her. And this all happens within the first couple of chapters. This isn't a huge spoiler. Mm-hmm. And then she says, "This can't be happening," or "This isn't happening." And just like that, it isn't happening. It never did happen, except that everybody that died is still dead, and nobody even remembers they ever existed. So this freaks her out.
Yeah.
And then the mysterious stranger shows up. Carl Yatzer is his name, and he explains to her that, in fact, she is not living in the first world, our world. She's living in a world that she shaped, and that it's one of a vast number of shaped worlds inside a labyrinth, an extra-dimensional labyrinth, and all of the shapers of these worlds live inside those worlds. The weird thing is she doesn't remember this. She should remember that she's the shaper, and she doesn't, but she does have power to shape her world still. And he says that the bad guy that came in, the adversary, is taking over her world now that he's stolen the knowledge of it from her, and she has no choice but to flee her world, but he thinks she has the power to rescue all the other worlds in the labyrinth from this adversary if she can travel from world to world and gather the knowledge of those worlds, of the making of those worlds, and take it to the mysterious Egrer, who's at the center of all of this and is the one who has put all these shapers into all these shaped worlds. So the first book is largely her and Carl fleeing the adversary across her version of our world, which is changing around her because the adversary has the ability to shape it some as well. And spoiler, they do survive.
Well,
there's a second book.
Pardon me while I cut into my own giggling, because it is time for our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit about a little bit more about the setting of the first book, and then we'll be moving on to Master of the World. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMc Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMc Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Edward Willett about his Worldshapers series. Before the break, we were talking about the first one, Worldshaper, and the fact that it takes place in Montana. If you're a regular listener, then you know that I grew up in Montana, so of course I have to bring it up, which I do now in the interview. So let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
Side note, I grew up in Montana, and so it was so much easier when I realized it was a shaped world, and I didn't have to spend my time going, wait, that's not right. That's not right. But you did include moose drool, so very good.
You even knew what that was, did you? Yeah, that's from a trip to Whitefish a few years ago that we did.
Oh, yeah, that's not too far from where I grew up. We actually had moose drool at my wedding.
It's a beer, we should perhaps explain.
It's beer. I was just going to say it's beer for those of you listening and wondering what the heck we're talking about.
Yeah, it was fun because although it seems like our world, you quickly realize it isn't quite, because I threw in, everybody has high phones instead of iPhones, and they watch StreamPix instead of Netflix, and lacrosse is the big professional sport.
Right. So what was your inspiration for this series and this, I can't say world, these worlds, I guess?
The idea had mutated a bit. It was always the idea of having all these shaped worlds. That came along early, and I think the basic idea for that was just what would it be like if authors of books could live inside the worlds that they create for their books, because that's really what's happening here in a way. All of these shapers are like the authors of the stories that are going on inside the worlds that they have chosen to shape, and they get to live inside them. Now, I personally would shape my worlds very differently than I have if I had to live inside them. And they do, and we'll explore that as the series goes on. But that was kind of the basic idea. It was originally a flat-out fantasy set in a valley with side valleys that led to different worlds, and it was all magic. And now it has a science fictional underpinning instead. But that was kind of the idea. What would it be like if authors could live inside their own novels?
Oh, interesting. And so let's talk about Shawna, who's the main character. What do you think about her will resonate with readers?
I hope they will like her. She's smart. She's not a dumb character by any means. She doesn't know what's going on, but she is smart. She's resourceful. And I mean, admittedly, in the first book, she is kind of floundering and trying to figure out and discovering things. And she has a sarcastic sense of humor, which I hope people will enjoy.
I did. So that gives us the overview and brings us to the second book, which we don't want to give too much away in, but talk about and give a bit of an overview of the second book, which is called Master of the World.
Well, at the end of the first book, obviously, she does escape her world and makes it into the second world. She's misplaced Karl Yatzer right off the top of the book, so she's alone, and she has to try to figure out what the heck's going on. And the first thing that happens is that she gets hauled up onto this airship that she recognizes from a Jules Verne novel called Robur the Conqueror. It's a ship called the Albatross, and it flies by multiple helicopter vanes. It's basically a flying ship held up by numerous whirling blades and other blades for propelling it and so forth. And she quickly catches on that the world she's in is loosely based on Jules Verne and has a lot of the elements. But when she thinks she knows what's going on because she knows Jules Verne a bit, she then is disabused of the notion that it's entirely matched up to Jules Verne, and she gets herself into trouble by thinking she knows stuff that she doesn't actually know. And yeah, the second book is she has to try to find the shaper of the world, and she expects Karl Yatzer to show up somewhere, but she doesn't know where, and she has to hope to be in the right place at the right time to reconnect with him so they can carry out their mission to get what's called the Hakma, which is the knowledge of the making of the world, from the shaper, whoever it is, and carry it on to the next world. But she's floundering a bit because she doesn't have her guide with her.
Yes, her very grumpy guide, but helpful, but also grumpy. Why Jules Verne?
I've always liked Jules Verne. I didn't read a lot of him when I was a kid, but I read The Mysterious Island, and I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and I remember the movie and all that. And Jules Verne was an amazing. I mean, he was a hard science fiction writer for his day. He was taking, current science and technology and extrapolating it into the future. Now, of course, he got a lot of elements wrong, and so now we look back at it, and it seems odd, like the giant cannon going to the moon and stuff like that. But within his knowledge of the time, he was trying to keep it accurate. So he's really a giant figure in early science fiction. And looking back at it now, he just had all these great machines and ideas that just bubbled up in his stories, and I just thought it would be fun to play in a world like that and get a little steampunk in.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun because you get the kind of fantastical elements of like the cannon shooting the person to the moon, but also just then the variations that happen that aren't so quite so much.
And it was basically, well, Jules Verne didn't give me what I need, so I'll just create what I need in a kind of Jules Verne way, like the little individual helicopters that figure into it and things like that. Because it is, after all, a novel, and the shaper of the world could make whatever changes he wanted. He didn't have to slavishly follow Jules Verne either, and he didn't, and so it all works out story-wise.
Yeah, that makes it easier. Karl mentions at one point in the first book that there are possibly hundreds of worlds. So this series could, in theory, go on for a very long time. Do you have kind of a vision for the arc for the series?
I know where it goes at the end, but in between there are as many books as I want, or as the publisher wants, more to the point. There will be a third one for sure because I'm writing it right now, and then we'll see after that. But I do know what happens when everything comes together at the end of the series. So the arcs in between will be individual stories with, advancing a few of the things, mysteries around Shawna's mysterious past, why she can't remember the fact that she's a shaper or her training in the first world or any of that stuff. I'll drop hints of that along the way, but the big climax is all in my head, just waiting for us to get to it.
Nice. That's great. What kind of research did you do for the series?
most of it in the first book was just stuff that came along as I was writing it. So, for example, at one point I needed to know what the surveyor's mark at the top of a mountain pass looks like. And so I dug it up and I put it in there. Or I had a sailing vessel and I needed to know what modern sailing vessels have in the way of autopilots and how they generate electricity and stuff like that. So I enjoyed doing that kind of research. In the second book, because of the Jules Verne, Jules Verne wrote a lot of books, so I wasn't going to go back and read all his books. But I did research the specific sections that when I was talking about like the Albatross or the Nautilus or the Terror, which are the three main, she's not on the Nautilus, but she's on a Nautilus-like submarine. I did see exactly how he had described them and how he said they were powered and things like that, and I dropped little bits of that in as it seemed appropriate. And if the other fun thing was, I think pretty much, not quite, but most of the minor characters share names with characters in Jules Verne's books. They have nothing to do with who they were in those books, but I pulled out their surnames and things like that and dropped them in for people who are really into Jules Verne might enjoy spotting some of those.
Right. You mentioned Shawna's sort of sarcastic sense of humor. She also loves to drop pop culture references into her comments, which Carl never gets. Lots of Star Trek, lots of great things like that. Is that Shawna, or is that a bit of you?
That's a lot of me. One of the great things about Shawna is that she's a first-person narrator. I think this isn't the only book I've written in first person. I think it's the only adult novel I've written in first person, probably. And so that gave me an opportunity to indulge in my sense of humor. So most of that stuff is my sense of humor coming through Shawna.
Okay. Yeah. Are there any other autobiographical elements in the series?
I don't know. I always say that everything authors write is a bit autobiographical because the only human being we really understand is ourselves. We may not understand ourselves perfectly. So all characters in a book are some aspect of the author's character, or at least how, because you're imagining yourself to be somebody else, so you're really putting your character into some other position and imagining how you would be in that situation. So you could say that everything is a bit autobiographical. Things will pop up as we go along, I'm sure. There's some, like her interest in musical theater comes from me. Because I'm a theater guy, things like that. So yeah, a lot of it comes through in her what she likes to talk about and her thinking and stuff is very much, a lot of it is coming from me, I admit.
Right.
Jumping in so we can take our second break of the podcast, but I love that Edward put that part of his personality in there because the Star Trek jokes kind of they made me laugh because I make Star Trek references, or I make references all the time that people don't get, and they just look at me like Carl looks at Shawna. So I appreciated that, and the musical theater references, just, lots of little quirky things that made me like Shawna even more. So let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll wrap up this interview with Edward Willett. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMc Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMc Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Edward Willett, author of Master of the World. We were just talking about Shawna's tendency to throw out pop culture references that nobody gets. But let's go ahead and get back to the interview with Edward.
You said you're working on the third one. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Oh, sure. The cover art is out
nice.
as of last week, in fact. When we have a title, we didn't have a title for a while. The title in my head, just for writing purposes, it was never going to be on the book, was Werewolves and Vampires and Peasants. Oh, my.
Okay, I can see that.
Which pretty much, tells you what the book is about. And the actual title is The Moonlit World. And we get a glimpse of it in Master of the World, because Shawna at one point gets a glimpse into the next world over, and she sees this, basically what appears to be a werewolf running toward her. And sure enough, when they get into the third world, there are werewolves, and there are vampires, and there are peasants.
Oh,
and
my.
they have to navigate their way through that.
Right. Fun, and also yikes. Are there any of your other novels that you would like to talk about?
Well, the couple other recent ones I do have. Before this, my book for Daw was a standalone science fiction novel, which is, always nice if you want to try out an author and not commit to a series. And it's called The City Born. And that one is, it came out of an image of a giant city or tower crouched over a canyon that was full of garbage, and that's exactly what the story is. It's this giant metal city, very hierarchical. The rulers live at the top, and it gets progressively worse as you go down. And then it's crouched over this canyon, and it's been there so long the canyon has filled up with rubbish, and the lowest of the low survive as scavengers on the rubbish heap down there. And a girl from the top of the city literally falls into the garbage heap, gets rescued by a scavenger boy. I say boy, they're 20. That seems like a boy and a girl to me, but it's a little over the usual YA. It's not really a YA book. And then all of a sudden everybody's chasing them, and they have to find out why. So that was the one just before this, and that one I'm very pleased with, and I think people would enjoy that as well. The other most recent thing I put out was actually a reissue of a book I wrote years ago called Spirit Singer. I have a little publishing company called Shadow Paw Press, which is named after our cat, and his picture's on every book as the logo. And this was a book that won Saskatchewan Book Award and some e-book awards back when it came out. And I brought it out in a brand new, revised, updated, polished up edition. And that one's out there right now, too. And it's a very traditional young adult kind of a quest story.
Okay. Which actually reminds me, how would you classify the Worldshapers series? It's not quite young adult.
It's not young adult at all, really. There's not a teenager in the first book,
right?
But it is YA friendly, I think. I mean, Shawna is 27. She does look young on the cover. That's a function of the model they're using for the cover art. And there's also a sort of a retcon, if you know that word, for making up something after the fact to explain something. I do establish in the stories that the Shapers don't age the same as the other people in their world, so Shawna would actually look younger than her supposed age. But it's funny because it did get longlisted for a Sunburst Award. The Sunburst Awards are a juried award for Canadian science fiction and fantasy, and it was on the long list in the YA category, which surprised me because I keep thinking about it. There's not a teenager in the book.
No, it reads a little bit like a YA, but at times it does feel a little bit like that. But then there are other moments where it's very definitely adult. So
I would say maybe you'd call it a new adult novel. Maybe that's another category that sometimes gets used. But it's I think it's friendly to young readers, but I think it's any reader could enjoy it. I hope.
Yeah, I agree. On your website, there is some information about a podcast that you do, the Worldshapers podcast. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I started the Worldshapers at about the same time that Worldshaper came out, and the similarity in the names is not a coincidence. I've always been interested in talking to other authors about their writing process, very nuts and bolts kind of about, writing and revision and all that stuff. And I thought, well, I have a lot of contacts in the science fiction and fantasy world. Why don't I see who I can get and start this podcast? So it's been a little over a year now. I'm up to episode 37, I think, because I do it every 2 weeks generally. And I have some of the biggest names in the field have talked to me. So they're hour-long chats with people like John Scalzi, Robert J. Sawyer, Tanya Huff, Julie Sheneda, David Brin, Tad Williams, V.E. Schwab, Lee Modesitt Jr., Joe Haldeman. Those are just the ones off the top of my head. David Weber. I spend an hour. We talk a little bit about how they got started writing and interested in science fiction, and then it's about the process where from the idea to the planning and synopsisizing to the revision process and the editing process, and then some bigger philosophical questions at the end. And people seem to like it quite a bit. In fact, just this last weekend as we record this, 2 weeks ago when this airs, it was awarded the Aurora Award, which is Canada's equivalent to the Hugo Award. It's a fan-nominated and voted-on award for best fan-related work. So I have a nice trophy now for it.
Nice. That's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's just theworldshapers.com is the website, and everything is on there. Plus, full transcripts.
Oh, nice. Okay. You mentioned that you've been writing fiction for 26 years now. What made you decide to transition from journalism and freelance writing to writing some fiction?
I've been writing fiction for 40 years. It's just that I quit and became a full-time writer 26
Oh, okay.
years ago.
Sorry.
I actually started in high school. Well, my very first short story was called Castor Glass Hypership Test Pilot. I was 11 years old. And
wow.
My junior high English teacher read it, and he didn't just pat me on the head. He said, I don't understand why your characters are doing this, or this didn't make sense to me. And I've credited him ever since. In fact, I dedicated The City Born to him. Tony Tunbridge was his name. For kind of giving me that kickstart and thinking, I'm going to keep writing things, and I'm going to try to make the next thing better. So I wrote 3 novels in high school, and then when I started as a newspaper reporter, I was still writing fiction on the side. Somewhere in there, I sold a couple of short stories in the 80s, but it took a long time before I got a novel out. But I was writing them. I probably had 10 written before I had found a publisher for one. So, I've been writing fiction a long time. So that was always my focus. And the journalism was actually, I was too hard-headed to just plunge into writing. I thought, well, nobody makes a living as a writer, at least not when they start off. So I'm going to go into something where I will be writing, but I'll actually get a regular paycheck, and that's why I went into journalism.
Thank you. Out of your experience, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
I actually give it all the time. I'm currently writer in residence at the Saskatoon Public Library, which means that people come into me with their writing, and I give them advice. So,
nice.
But what it usually boils down to is read. You have to read. You have to read in the genre you want to write in. But it's not just that. It's the act of reading fiction. You internalize the ways that stories are told in fiction, and all fiction writers are dealing with the same problems of characterization and description and moving the action along and all of that. So by reading analytically is great, but even just reading for fun, you kind of absorb it. At least I did, kind of like a sponge. And then the other advice is to write and don't get stuck on one thing. So write something to the best of your ability, send it out, try to get it published or whatever you're going to do with it, and then write the next thing. And the writing itself is the practice, like anything else where you want to be good at, whether it's sports or being a painter or whatever, you have to practice, and writing is its own practice. So I think it was Stephen King that said you have to write 500,000 words of crap before you write anything that might be publishable.
Wow.
Your mileage may vary, but still, I think I was somewhere up there before I sold a novel. So.
I feel like I'd be counting 500 and 1. I should be there.
That's right. I think Ray Bradbury said 800,000, so you know.
Oh, man, okay. So there's some number. So in terms of reading, who are your favorite authors and genres?
Well, I mostly read in science fiction and fantasy on the fiction side. On nonfiction, I like history and science books. But on the fiction side, it's hard to say. Right now, mostly what I'm reading are the authors I'm interviewing on the podcast.
Yep,
so the people that I've got lined up are the ones that I read next. But going back, the influential ones were, I'm just the right age where I was still getting the sort of the golden age science fiction authors. So it was Isaac Asimov and Robert A. Heinlein, in particular, above all else, Robert A. Heinlein on the science fiction side, and Arthur C. Clarke, the big three of the time. On fantasy, of course, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. Another one I always like to mention is Andre Norton from that era. And then spreading out from there, but those were kind of the ones that got me into reading science fiction and then writing it.
Okay. Thank you for that. You have a website. You've mentioned the website for the podcast. So say the address of your website and where people might be able to find you on social media.
I am at justmyname.com, edwardwillett.com, but make sure there are two T's on Willett. That's the most common error. So it's Edward, WILLETT.com. It's a very complete website. It's been around for a long time, and stuff has piled up on it. So there's tons of material on there, some of it going back to when I used to write a weekly science column. Those are mostly on there. And then on social media, I'm at eWillett on Twitter, EWILLETT. The Worldshapers is on there, at the Worldshapers. And on Facebook, it's just Edward.Willett, I believe, is my Facebook page, my author page. I have an Instagram account, but I'm not active on it particularly. I keep thinking one of these days, but I never get around to it.
Right. That happens. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to bring up at this point?
I think that covers it for the moment. I've always got more things in the works. I guess the only thing I haven't mentioned is I am supposed to be writing a young adult dark fantasy kind of horror thing for Cheezine Publications, which is Cheezine Books, which is a Canadian publisher that kind of specializes in the darker side of things. So I'm looking forward to that. That won't be out, though, till 2021, I believe, is when it's scheduled, and I haven't even started writing it yet. But I do know what it's about. So it's about shape changers. So in a way, the book I'm writing now with the werewolves and the vampires and stuff kind of ties into what I'll be doing in that book later down the road. So that's kind of the next thing I know I've got coming for sure.
Nice. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I loved the first two books. I'm excited for the third one and possibly the 829th one, depending on how many worlds there are.
I should live so long.
Yeah. Again, it's the Worldshapers series. And Edward, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you once again to Edward Willett for joining me to talk about his Worldshaper series. Again, the first one is called Worldshaper. The second one is Master of the World. They are available in both print and audiobook. So whichever way you like to enjoy a story, those are available. They are a lot of fun, very different. You don't this concept of the labyrinth and all the different worlds. I am intrigued and I'm interested to see where it's going to go and really how Carl and Shawna are going to figure out everything they need to do to defeat the adversary, if that is what is eventually going to happen, which I assume so, but who knows? Who knows what might happen? That will be the fun in finding out. So thank you again to Edward. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I so much appreciate you. If you are a fan of this podcast, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and, following us, subscribing, go to social media and like posts, share posts, do all that wonderful stuff. And if you're really feeling kind today, if you wouldn't mind giving us a 5-star review, that would be awesome and would really help us out. I appreciate you always, and I appreciate you in advance if you decide to subscribe, follow, review, blah, blah, blah. Thank you for that. Thank you again for joining me for this episode of the GSMc Book Review Podcast. Join me again on Tuesday when we will be switching from steampunk, fantasy, science fiction to aliens. Still science fiction, but aliens. They are among us, or are they? I will be speaking with author Christina Rienzi about her book appropriately titled Among Us. So join me for that on Tuesday. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful November weekend, and I hope that weekend involves time for you to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMc to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.